Good evening, everyone. I'm Alan Miller, co-founder of the Together Declaration. Welcome to the second in our series of Together Talks. This one this evening is on the online safety bill and the question to what extent it's a challenge or impact on censorship or not. We're very lucky this evening to have three excellent speakers, which I'm going to introduce in a moment. Just to say that when the white paper on the online harms came out in 2019, there was all sorts of language in there with all sorts of recommendations. And this has actually been going through the Commons and the House of Lords back and forth. And on the 18th of this month, something will be coming out about it. Perhaps people will have seen today that Michael Singer was actually taken off Twitter. We've seen a number of people like Peter McCulloch and others that have recently been taken down. And many of us know from Together that in the discussion around lockdowns and the pandemic, there have been many people that have already been taken off social media and big tech. And we're very interested to hear from you guys and your views. As always, we consider everyone to be grown up and adults. And that means that people can say pretty much what they like, but they do it in a civil way. And we're not shouting and heckling one another, but we're listening and responding in the spirit of free speech and open debate, which is one of the 7 pillars of Together. So I'm going to get straight into it. Our speakers this evening, we're very lucky to be joined by Toby Young from the Free Speech Union. And Toby's a well-known social commentator and writer, many years experiencing as a commentator. We've also got Jennie Bristow, who's a sociologist and a writer. And actually wrote with her daughter a book during the lockdown, which is very productive and sort of kind of shames me somewhat. And then we've also got Frances Hoare, who's very well known to many of you, a barrister, and has also written extensively on free speech and this issue. So we're going to have about 7 minutes each for the speakers. Then I'm going to speak to them about some of the questions that are coming up. Then we're going to come out to you guys, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you want to speak, and then we'll do them in rounds of questions, and we'll come back and we'll do a few of those. So everyone's going to get a chance to speak and ask a question or make your point about some of the thoughts you've had. So over to you, please, Toby. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. So I'm going to start by trying to steel man the case for the bill. So to try and put the best case for the bill so we know what we're arguing against and we can make our counter arguments as robust as possible. First of all, the phrase which was originally included in the online harms white paper, which was published when Theresa May was still Prime Minister, the phrase legal but harmful, and the duty that social media companies and search engines were going to have to remove legal but harmful content, that's gone. So I've been talking to officials and ministers, and the latest iteration of the bill hasn't been published. We think it's going to be published next week, but I've been assured that that phrase, legal but harmful, and that duty on social media companies, search engines to remove legal but harmful content won't be in the next version of the bill to be published. That doesn't mean that social media companies won't continue to remove legal but harmful content. What the government intends to do, what the bill will ask social media companies to do, will be to set out in their terms of service what content they intend to allow and what content they intend to prohibit, and it'll be they'll have license to remove themselves legal but harmful content, but they won't be required to do that. They'll be required to carry out risk assessments to evaluate harmful content, whether legal or unlawful, but there'll be no requirement in the bill for social media companies, search engines to remove legal but harmful content. They'll just be given the option to do that. And if they do choose to do that, the Ofcom will be empowered in the bill to make sure they do it consistently. So the idea is this will actually help improve things because it will make it more difficult for Twitter to remove, say, Trump on the grounds that things he says incite violent insurrection, but to leave the official account of the Kremlin, when Putin is doing far more than merely inciting violent insurrection. So Ofcom will, under the new bill about to be published, will be tasked with making sure social media companies enforce their terms of service in a transparent, consistent, non-arbitrary, politically unbiased way, an impartial way. So that they think will improve things. The only harmful content that the bill will compel social media companies, search engines to remove will be unlawful harmful content. And that's going to be defined in the bill. So the bill is going to incorporate the recommendations of the Law Commission of England and Wales to repeal the Malicious Communications Act and other communications offences and replace them with a catch-all harm-based communications offence. One complicating thing about this is I don't think that aspect of the bill will apply outside England and Wales, because I think communications offences are a devolved area of legislation. So that's complicated, but nonetheless, in England and Wales, the harmful content which social media companies and search engines will be obliged to remove by this bill will be unlawful harmful content as defined by this new harm-based communications offence that is going to be included in the bill, and it's going to be less censorious, supposedly, so we're told, than the existing cluster of communications offences. So that they think will actually make things better. It'll be more permissive than the existing prohibitions on what you're prohibited from saying by law. And the social media companies will only have to remove content which meets the definition of unlawful harm under that new definition of harmful. I have various concerns about the recommendations of the Law Commission. I think the definition of harmful in this new harm-based communications offence is too broad, and we can go into detail about that. Another concern I have about this aspect of the bill is that social media companies, search engines, they aren't experts in what communications will meet the prosecution test for unlawful harmful communication. And this will be a new law, so even the CPS won't be particularly expert in it, but Twitter and Facebook and Instagram won't be at all expert in it. And one concern I have is that if they're going to be faced with swingeing fines from Ofcom if they fail to remove unlawful content according to this new harm-based communications offence, they're going to err on the side of caution. They're not going to just remove content which meets the threshold for criminal prosecution under this new harm-based communications offence, but anything which is in the ballpark, anything they think might meet that threshold rather than what actually will meet that threshold. So that's one concern, but nonetheless, it could be worse. And when I say that under the new bill, under the new regime, the regulatory regime created by the bill, which is going to empower Ofcom with as the new regulator of social media and search engines, when I say that social media companies, search engines won't be required to remove harmful, legal but harmful content, but will have the option of doing so. There are various safeguards for freedom of speech, so social media companies won't have complete latitude when it comes to saying in their terms of service what lawful content they intend to remove. So, so the three safeguards are, first of all, they'll have to have regard when drawing up their terms of service. They'll have to have regard for freedom of speech. Secondly, they won't be able to remove as easily, at any rate, journalistic content. And thirdly, it'll be harder to remove. There'll be more protections around what's described in the bill as content of democratic importance. Setting aside the third of those, I have concerns about the first two. Concern about greater protections for content of journalistic importance, making it harder for social media companies to remove content of journalistic content, rather. Well, how is that defined? Is Ofcom going to create a register? And unless you're on this register, then you don't count as a journalist and you won't be entitled to that protection. They say they're not going to do that, but they haven't made it clear how they're going to define what content counts as journalism. Will citizen journalists count, or will only journalists for publications that are regulated by Impress or Ipso count? That's not clear, and I'm hoping that journalistic content will, when the bill is published, be defined very broadly as possible. But my primary concern is that the free speech safeguard, whereby social media companies, search engines will, under the bill, have to have regard for free speech. That's the least onerous of the legal duties, and nothing like as onerous as their duty to remove harmful content. In order to meet that legal duty, Twitter could simply say, well, we did consider the free speech implications of banning, say, J.K. Rowling from our platform. We considered them, and then we completely dismissed them without a second thought. That would be complying with the legal duty to have regard for free speech. All it means is you just have to consider for a second or two the free speech implications of what you're doing, and then you can entirely dismiss them, and you still satisfied your legal duty to have regard for free speech. So one of the things the Free Speech Union is lobbying for, amongst other things in this bill, is to increase that to a much more onerous legal duty, so it's on a par with the legal duty social media companies, search engines have to remove harmful content. I think broadly, just stepping back a little bit from all of this detail, my view is that this bill will probably make things a little bit worse than they are at present. But that's not the real threat to free speech. The real threat to free speech is what social media companies are doing already. As you mentioned in your introduction, Alan, Michael Sanger, he's just been banned from Twitter, and not because he's said anything unlawful, just because he's been tweeting, counter-narrative content for, the past 2 years or so. We already see Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram removing perfectly lawful content that dissents from the mainstream view, or even the view that the panjandrums that the social media companies take about the pandemic, or about climate change, or about the debate between gender critical feminists and trans rights activists. I mean, that censorship is enormous. It's all pervasive. We see social media companies engaging in that kind of censorship all the time as things stand. For my money, the real difficulty with this bill is it's a missed opportunity. We have an opportunity here to hold social media companies who, after all, they are now the public square. They are where democratic debate takes place. We have an opportunity to hold them to a higher standard, to impose much more onerous free speech duties on them, whereby it becomes much more difficult for them to remove people like Michael Sanger, to take down videos by people like Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff and Shunetra Gupta and Michael Levitt. It's an opportunity to make sure social media companies are held to a much higher standard, given the pivotal critical role they now play in democracies and democratic debate across the world. And that opportunity at the moment isn't being taken by this government. So what the Free Speech Union is trying to do is to lobby the government to try and, at the very least, impose a much more exacting free speech duty on social media companies in the bill, so they find it more difficult. So they'd be threatened with fines, censure of various kinds, if they do engage in censorship, particularly censorship which is politically motivated in response to political activists deluging social media companies with complaints and so forth. So that's my broad view. The bill itself doesn't pose a huge threat to free speech. The real problem is it's a missed opportunity. We could actually be improving the free speech protections on social media via this bill, and the government is not doing that.
Okay, Toby, thank you very much. Jennie Bristow, please.
Thanks, Alan. So I should start by saying I'm in no way an expert on on this bill. I'm not even a natural internet user. I'm basically terrified of Twitter. One of the miseries of the pandemic for me was how much of my life and work had to get transferred online. And when thinking about this event, I had to look up a whole load of things like revenge porn, epilepsy trolling, cyber flashing, all of these kind of things that have been talked about in relation to this bill, which do sound really quite nasty. I certainly don't see the online world as a safe space for me and my kids. The way I see it is that, well, as Toby says, it is social space now. It's what we see online mirrors the diversity and the depravity of real life. And you get this sense that, why there's a push to try and regulate this space is because of a kind of a desire to make it nicer. What concerns me is that all of these attempts won't work to make the online world nicer, if indeed that's kind of what we want. And attempts to do that will bring in a lot of new dangers. So there's obvious questions to raise around the definition of terms. What counts as harm? What counts as safety? Who decides? These are all things that I hope will come up in the discussion. What I wanted to do just in these few minutes is raise some broader social questions about what it looks to me as a kind of outsider, if you like, what this bill is trying to do, and to suggest some more constructive ways of going about the problem insofar as there is one. So it seems to me that what the bill is kind of trying to do, and the kind of constant updates that are coming through on it, is to make a statement about all kinds of human behaviour that are seen as bad, and to stop people from expressing this online. It's like a kind of diminutive utopian law and order project where, there's a basic acceptance that you can't stop people being venal, cruel, cowardly, criminal, telling lies, whatever. There's an implicit recognition, well, this is the world that we live in, but there's an idea that you can kind of make a symbolic statement that this stuff is bad and kind of write it all down in the bill. And that's why things keep being added, I think. I mean, I think this has been called a kitchen sink bill. There seems to be no end of bad things that can be added in. And it takes the form, it seems to me, as a kind of knee-jerk virtue signalling, which is not actually, well, it is symbolic, but will have some real consequences, not least that it risks making people actually more vulnerable online, as opposed to improving any kind of safety. I mean, say what I mean by that. Nadine Dorries says the government wants to legislate to make the UK the safest place to be online while enshrining free speech. And it seems that the government kind of envisages a way of doing that, which relies on a whole system of sort of technical processes. It talks about systems and processes to make what can be actually finely balanced decisions. I mean, what counts as harmful and what's just offensive? What's misinformation and what's disinformation? These two terms seem to be collapsed together. And systems and processes, in my experience, the way these things work, tend to be a very blunt instrument, right? They don't work, and often they are kind of relied upon as a way of getting around the bigger problem that I think is the heart of this, which is the problem of judgment. Now, that's a problem for regulators, with these sort of slippery terms that are being brought in. How do you make the claim that one thing is harmful and the other thing is not harmful, and how do you decide? Who decides? I think the problem of judgment is also an important issue for users, and this is where I want to propose a better solution, which is probably going to sound a bit old-fashioned and a bit woolly, but I think it really is the only way to go. And that's it. That's that if we accept that the online world has the same depth and diversity of problems and opportunities, right? There is some good stuff online, as the real world. it seems to me the best approach is not to deify online or to demonize it, but to treat it as a space to be handled with care, as we would in other social spaces in our lives, and to engage with the world online properly as a part of social life, rather than persisting in seeing it as something kind of separate and out there, and that is actually amenable to an independent kind of regulation. So the approach to it should be trusting and expecting people to exercise judgment in relation to what they see, whilst acknowledging that there are risks on there that people have to navigate. And it seems that just as we need more freedom and I would also say civility actually in public space, in terms of having proper discussions, having proper democratic discussions, that's what we should be thinking about, right? We should be thinking about how do we have good, honest debates, not ones in which people are forced to agree with each other, but debates where people are able to argue things out, rather than an approach that seems to trying to evade this problem with the effect of stifling online expression.
Thank you, Jenny. Very useful. Could you keep your mutes on if you're not speaking, please, so we don't get the interruptions. Thank you. And now over to you, Francis, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan. Firstly, I should say that I wasn't aware, I clearly don't have the same inside knowledge that Toby has of the proposals by the government, or what seems to be the proposals by the government to change quite significantly some of by far the worst provisions of this bill as it stood before it when it was last debated in Parliament. And what I will say at the outset is, if Toby is right, that there is no longer going to be a duty to remove content and investigate content that is potentially harmful in a way that's undefined by reference to the criminal law or civil wrongs, then that is a significant victory, I would suggest, for the campaigns that many of us have been having, both in the public sphere and I'm sure Toby has been very much part of this, in close liaison with ministers and others. So I would certainly welcome, to the extent that it is far less seriously problematic, if that is right. Because what I was going to talk about, and I will, is the objections to the bill as they stand. And we still obviously haven't had a publication of the new suggestion, which will significantly change what was in the white paper and what we understood we were looking at. And we still need to be live to the problem that reflects. So I'm going to talk about the way in which the law is currently structured and why that works, particularly with social media companies that are hosts to vast amounts of material by members of the public, millions and millions of people speaking about all number of topics, and why the new suggestion, which might be modified somewhat if Toby's right, is so dangerous. The current system is that a social media company is not formally a publisher. That is to say, is not legally responsible for the contents of what somebody puts up if it is organic content. And that's an important, and what organic content means is that they simply put a message on Twitter or on Facebook. They don't pay for an advertisement. It's not moderated in advance. And Twitter has no knowledge about it because it goes on the site automatically. Twitter or Facebook or YouTube only become a publisher if they're made aware of that content and they don't take steps to remove it within what is a reasonable period, which is approximately 28 days at the moment, but it can vary. Now, the reason why I suggest that is a good thing is because, of course, there will be all sorts of material on the internet that is harmful, that is dangerous. And if a social media company becomes aware of it, then of course they must have a duty to investigate it. Of course, they must have a duty to put sufficient resources into that. But that is not to say that they should have a freewheeling responsibility and duty to investigate everything that is on their sites. Not only is that totally impossible to do in a proportionate way because of the number of users they have, but it also inflates their right and their ability to be censors. What's particularly disturbing about the bill as it currently stands, and it has to be said, would also be concerning about the very ill-defined offence of a harm-based communications offence, which we don't know what that's going to be. We have the references, the recommendations from the Law Commission, but we're at sea at the moment as to what that might be. But the concern that we should have about that is that where an offence or where a non-criminal harm-based concept, which is the current way in which the bill is phrased, it is there. You do not know what is lawful and what is not, and you do not know what could be censored and what could not. And as Toby and Jenny have both said, it is crucial in a free society that we are able to discuss matters completely freely within certain limits, but not within limits that suggest, for example, that you are unable to question the narrative around, for example, public health, simply because that might cause harm to people. If you have that concept that is in the bill as it currently stands, of causing harm to an adult of reasonable firmness, that is wholly undefined. If you have that, then you are opening up a system in which the censor, which is what they will be, whether that's the government ultimately in considering whether the social media company has performed its duties adequately, or in the first instance, the social media company, they will be responsible for deciding what causes harm. And we know how Twitter and Facebook consider their duties, because if somebody like Michael Senger says that that the current public health policies are based on fraud, he is removed completely from Twitter. That, you might think, should be a reasonable debate. So that's the problem with that. What I've suggested is that really we should be turning this on its head. And what we should be doing is ensuring that social media companies of a sufficiently large size, that is to say, that are open to anyone, that don't have a membership fee, that don't exclude those who don't believe in a particular pattern of belief, or are not in a particular club, for example, which there might be good reason why you would want to restrict speech if you were in a social club or if you were members of a religion or a political party. But that doesn't apply to Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. If you're in that position, you don't have that that strict route to membership, you're open to all comers, then you should be prevented, I suggest, from removing any material that isn't a civil harm itself, i.e. defamation or other civil harms, or a criminal offence. That creates a clear definition of what is able to be said online and what is able not to be said. And of course, it might be the case that you could investigate as a social media company whether or not something is a criminal offence, whether or not something is a civil harm. And of course, there should be protections on social media companies that remove content while they investigate it. But unless we have a clear framework as to what can be said and what can not be said by companies that are effectively monopolies on particular forms of debate, we will allow those companies enormous power. And while those companies have facilitated great debate, they have become, and they should not be, censors and restricting what is in public discourse. So that's what I would propose, turning this whole thing on its head.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Alan. Sorry, that's slightly over time.
That's fine, thank you. my first question to you all, but I want to start with Toby, is that, I mean, Toby, 2 years now, the Free Speech Union, congratulations. You've had some remarkable achievements of getting people reinstated, actually organising and doing things so that people that have been cancelled, some of them that, you know, you get their positions back, and it's really strong. But, you know, you were saying perhaps put in measures that can make it more robust around the free speech elements. Surely in a free society where we should be demanding free speech, and that should be in every arena. And it's, you know, it's interesting because the Conservative government have talked about having all these measures for free speech to stop what they would call, some people would say, a woke agenda, or other things about what you can and can't say in PC things. Yet at the same time, there's been these measures. Many of them look very egregious, if you're right, that some of these elements might have been taken out. But surely the key thing is if the public are able to insist that there's free speech, that would put a lot of pressure. And isn't it the case that the government's kind of outsourcing this to big tech and not taking responsibility themselves and kind of going, well, you handle that issue over there, and then outsourcing it? And isn't that part of the problem, or would you see it differently?
Well, I think there's a kind of doctrinal schism among Conservatives as to the extent to which the state should intervene and insist that private companies like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube uphold free speech. Like the argument you hear when I've been, you know, sitting in front of ministers making the argument, this is an opportunity to hold social media companies to a much higher standard and ensure that they're not nearly as censorious as they are at present. And that's happening in Poland, incidentally. There's a similar bill in Poland, which is holding social media companies to a much higher standard. The Polish government, needless to say, is much less squeamish than the British Conservative government about intervening, the state intervening to impose these various obligations on private companies. But one argument you hear when you make that case to members of the government is, well, that would be a breach of these private companies' freedom of association. So there's a kind of conflict here between free speech on the one hand and freedom of association on the other. And it's not the, you know, which is why they say, well, you know, it's not our job to take on the lion's share of the regulation of social media. We want social media companies to become largely self-regulating. I mean, for all sorts of reasons, but one of them is that Ofcom just doesn't have the resources to become a fully fledged regulator of social media platforms. So they're hoping that you know, the financial burden will be of regulation will be taken on by the social media companies themselves. But there is this kind of, you know, they make this argument, no, well, we don't want to be too intrusive. We don't want to tell these private companies, you know, as state actors, you know, how they should be behaving. It's up to them to say in their terms and conditions what they will and won't allow. And if they won't allow some legal but nonetheless harmful speech, according to their lights, if they won't allow what they call hate speech, even if it's not unlawful, then that's their right as private companies. And it would be overreach and a breach of libertarian principles for the state to intervene. To which the counter argument is, well, hang on a second, you're imposing this kind of light duty to have regard for free speech. You're insisting that there should be additional protections for journalistic content and content of democratic importance. So you've already crossed that Rubicon. You're already imposing these various obligations on these private companies. Why not just go a little bit further? You know, it's not like there's a sacred principle here. You've already effectively breached that principle. You've crossed that bridge. Just do it with a bit more conviction. But I think, Alan, the reason the government, I think one of the reasons it's reluctant to go further and impose more onerous free speech obligations on social media companies in this bill is that it doesn't want to be seen to be overreaching, becoming too intrusive as a state. That wouldn't be, the right conservative position. It's light touch. That's how they think of it, as light touch, hand on the tiller, rather than a kind of big, forceful intervention.
Well, it's interesting. I want to go to Francis and take that point that Toby's just made, and then throw in Jenny's idea about judgment and decision making, because some of the concern by people is that, particularly with tech, the things that started off in the halcyon days of do no evil, now you've got AI, you've got all these mechanisms. You don't have even lawyers. That might be bad enough, having lawyers deciding if what you say is right or wrong, but you have algorithms, you have buzzwords, you have these things come up, and you might be taken off for whatever reason. Is there an element in which it's a collapse of judgment and they're just trying to outsource this to others? Or do you agree that perhaps they're being a bit conscientious and not being too dominant as the state? Certainly the perception of many in the public, many people we talk to, is that this is a real overreach and it will be used to continue suffocating free speech, which has been going in that direction somewhat. How do you see it, Francis?
I'd say, well, I take on the minister's objection in this way. The Adam Smith, who's obviously the great father of free economic theory, said that if people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the consequence ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise pub prices. Now, he's obviously talking about competition there and cartels in the way that we classically see them. And we have means and mechanisms in a free market system to restrict cartels and restrict monopolies. A monopoly is often considered to be not necessarily a company that has a complete control of the marketplace, but has a wholly disproportionate share of it, such that it forms of speech online, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube are monopolies. Twitter is a monopoly for the particular type of message-based communication and discussion. Yes, of course, there are rivals such as Getter and Parler and so on, but they're such a small part of the marketplace that the classic definition of Twitter would be as a monopoly. Facebook for its type of communication, YouTube for videos. Again, there are alternatives, but they are of small proportion compared to the proportion that those companies have. In that circumstance, it is perfectly correct and proper, taking a free market perspective, whether liberal or conservative in background, to say, no, I'm afraid if you are that type, if you have that sort of monopoly over that sort of speech, you should not be able to restrict it according to your whims. You are not going to be treated, and you should not be treated as an ordinary private company. Yes, of course, you can decide whether or not to go on Twitter, and you can go on to Getter if you wish, or if you're on Facebook, you can go to Brand YouTube or any of the other alternatives. But you know that the reality is that you will not have access to the enormous marketplace that you have, marketplace of ideas and engagement that you have on one of those three monopolies. And that's so with that, you could, one alternative would be to break them up. But I'm not sure that that's a realistic or desirable objective when you have one organization, such as, for example, Twitter, which has that kind of enormous ability to engage with people throughout the world, which is a positive thing. But with it comes responsibility. So the alternative, which I've suggested in the free speech report that I wrote was published last year, is this restriction on censorship, save where it is a civil wrong or a criminal offence. And that, I think, is and so I think the Polish government is doing exactly the right thing on that.
Thank you. So, I mean, Jenny, in America, you got the First Amendment, you got the Constitution, and it's written and it's codified. But in America as well, we've seen there's a big war on the whole idea of what you can say, when, and how, even though there's a Constitution and an amendment. If you look at some of the documents for this particular bill, it's gone back and forth with Parliament, and one of them from the House of Lords calls it Digital Technology and the Resurrection of Trust. And I suppose it leads to the question that I had when you were talking about judgment and authority and trust. and your idea of this, an attempt to kind of create a utopia somehow that might be on there. But I want to push you a bit, because people will say, and Francis says it as long as it's legal, but you know, there are all sorts of really uncomfortable, tricky things, aren't there? I mean, in a way, we've always had what they used to call the gutter press, right? And you know, whatever people think about, and people that have said all sorts of things, and lots of nasty things. I mean, should it be cleared up at all? Also, there's all sorts of discussions around when children look at things, and whose responsibility is that? I mean, is it the parents, or is it societies? And also, to what extent this would really ensure trust, or is there something about trusting the public and how we engage and being able to hear and see even really offensive things and terrible things, and how do we differentiate between offensive and terrible things? And there are obviously laws for certain acts, but the kind of the online representation of things can start getting a bit murky. So just how you kind of would respond. Is it like let everything just be out there and let us all just decide, or should there be some measures, and then how's that done? I mean, just your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's straightforward, right? Because I think that there is a thing where, you know, the online is it's been a rapidly changing and developing world that you know, is kind of like society, but also lacks a lot of those boundaries and everything else. And it's changed over time. I mean, I was thinking about, you know, when I first started even engaging with online, it was very much as a publisher. I mean, that was the role I think it used to play me way back in the millennium, you know, and there were like online magazines, and then it was a place where people would go and sort of play, you know, meet each other. It was all very rudimentary, whereas obviously what you have now is a much more complex web of interactions. It's a place where people create quite a lot of meaning for themselves as well, which is why I think there's so much anger and focus on representation and language and all of those issues. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that this isn't I don't think this is a technical question. I think there are technical questions, there are legal questions that come up in relation to certain things. But often it seems like what we're doing here is we're talking about problems, and we're saying, but well, those problems exist, but what can we do? What we can make sure that they don't kind of get represented online, rather than talking about the problems themselves. And so that's kind of what I meant, in the sense of it being a bit of a kind of a distraction. And, you know, I also think, I mean, in relation to what Toby and Francis were saying, I do think the trend that we're seeing towards this kind of outsourcing of stuff to companies, you know, just trying to say to corporations, well, can't you just be nice? I also think that's a very dangerous trend as well, because it moves decision making much further away from the democratic sphere, and kind of invests hope in, you know, organizations that aren't, you know, they're not moral entities, right? They're companies that are about making profits. So I think it's about, what I was trying to get at was kind of being less scared of the whole thing and bringing it more back to a public debate about how we think, you know, what we think about certain types of behavior and certain kinds of discussions that should be conducted.
And I suppose that would be the question I'm going to put back to you, Toby, and then you can all jump in, and I'm going to come out to people. But the idea of getting the government to buttress some of the freedom elements within it, surely the whole, well, not surely, but my question to you is that in a climate where there's been so many calls for so many different people to be silenced because people take offence in a range of areas, whether it's to do with the gender wars, or whether it's to do with kind of critical race theory, or your ideas of statues, or just saying that what you think a woman is, a whole range of different things. There are often calls and clamoring for people to be losing their jobs, to be silenced, to be taken off social media. is the way to handle that asking the government to write something in a bit more strongly, or is there something that the demos, the people, people have to insist upon? I mean, after all, surely the Enlightenment and the whole idea of these rights that we've got came as a consequence of people fighting and challenging and demanding those things, right? A long process that, from probably from the Reformation right through to the French Revolution and onwards, right? And so we get in a position where we expect to have free speech. Is there too much codifying everything in law and an attempt to do that rather than having a kind of relationship with the demos and doing it in that way? Or is it just the case now with technology you have to do something, right?
Well, I'm not sure that the demos is as reliable an ally in this battle as you seem to think. I used to think that certainly a majority of the public support free speech, think that they should be able to speak their minds without looking over their shoulders, abhor cancel culture, and think, when asked in surveys that political correctness has gone too far, similar phrases. And there does seem to be quite a lot of survey evidence that a majority of the public do feel that way. And I used to think that the way to win this battle was to, harness the silent majority to this cause, because for the most part, the censors are, professional elites. But the experience of the pandemic over the last 2 years, not just in Britain, but across Western democracies, it seems as though the public really do prioritize safety above liberty. I told myself at the beginning that this unprecedented interference in liberty by various governments, including our own, in March of 2020, and then repeatedly thereafter, was something the public wouldn't stand for. They wouldn't tolerate, particularly when, we were facing a virus which didn't pose a serious risk to most people. But I was wrong. I don't think the opinion polls were lying. I mean, there was a certain amount of priming of questions, and the polls were conducted online, which tends to slightly distort the results. You get more civic-minded people participating in online polling as opposed to people randomly called up or door knocking. But nonetheless, I think broadly speaking, you can't sugarcoat it. The public, the demos, across the Western world over the past 2 years were perfectly happy to sacrifice their liberties in order to make themselves safer. And that's really at the heart, I think, of all of this free speech battle. The rhetoric behind this bill: let's make the internet safe. Let's make Britain the safest place in the world to go online. It's appealing to this public appetite for safety, the willingness of the public to prioritize safety over liberty. And I think that's the fundamental battle that we have to fight. How do we bring back into focus the importance of liberty? How do we persuade people that wanting to be safe all the time, wanting to be protected from speech which is likely to challenge you, discomfort you, offend you, that the liberties that we fought so hard for are more important than that feeling of safety, than emotional well-being. It's a really difficult battle to fight, and I'm not sure how we go about doing that. But I'm not sure, Alan, that the demos is necessarily on our side in this fight, not at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I can see some hands up, and I want to go out to some questions, and that might have infuriated some people, or you might be completely in agreement with Toby. But I'm going to take them as I can see them. I'm going to take a couple of rounds to begin with. So we're going to have Bryce first, please.
Hi everybody, I'm actually from Canada, but I'm across the pond. So thank you for putting this on, because as a society in the West, we're all kind of facing these similar problems. There's a censorship bill on the table in our parliament here as well. So this is one of the reasons that I wanted to join and talk to you guys. So thank you for putting this on. I don't want to take too much of your time. So how much time do I have to talk about what I talk about?
You can make a point or ask a question. Go for it.
Okay. So I think the real core of what we're talking about here is not what is free speech, but our ability to have free speech online. Because as I posted in the chat, the ability to speak online is essentially our public discourse. And these places that we can do this, like Facebook and Twitter and all these places, are essentially controlled by or private corporations, right? And the real question is this: are the current trajectory that our countries are going down bringing us closer to more democracy or more authoritarianism, right? And what are the end game of these policies, right? And I've developed essentially a simple idea that there is a really core facet to all democracy, and that's the idea of one voice, one vote. The idea of democracy is that we each have a voice and we each have a vote. And whether or not we have the ability to exercise that is what's really important. And in our political systems, and I can't speak for you guys, but definitely in mine, our ability to speak that voice and have that vote is extremely limited. So do you have the ability to speak your voice? Do you have the ability, or sorry, is there the ability for your voice to be censored? Is there the ability for your voice to be heard and have an impact? And does the ability exist for your voice and vote to be suppressed or censored by people that don't agree with you? Because ultimately, these are technical questions, right? I have a voice, you have a voice, I want to have it heard, and I want to hear yours. But we don't have a system that is designed for us to collectively decide things, discuss things, and investigate these problems that we have. And that's kind of what my main point is. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Bryce. It was really good. Pete, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for hosting this. Just a question for the general panel is, you've all talked about the media companies as being monopolies. So specifically about COVID, given that there's a huge amount of lobbying that takes place in the United States, and the largest lobbying companies are the pharmaceutical and healthcare companies, how are we going to be able to separate out that connection between private corporations and governments realistically, so that we can actually achieve what we're referring to as democracy here? But, you know, it alludes back to Bryce's point that he's just asked as well. Are we heading to more democracy or more authoritarianism?
Thank you, Pete. And I'll take one more, and then I'm going to come back round to you guys. But I've got Colin, please.
Hi, thanks, Alan. Yeah, if you'll excuse me, I'll just preface my question based on my experience of actually partaking in direct consultations on the bill. And yeah, also speaking as a software entrepreneur here in the Silicon Valley for over 30 years. So, I mean, obviously online censorship is here, whether we like it or not, and most people here will agree why it's almost always wrong, outrageous and damaging. But you know, we're now in a digital era, as we know. And the point is, we've now got, you know, we've got public laws of the state, and they're combining with private laws of massive digital platforms. And that's where a lot of these problems lie. You know, obviously the platforms, you know, can make their business decisions. The problem is that governments are urging them on with pressures and measures founded on their personal experiences and, you know, information mostly coming from lobbyists. You know, and the media portray that they're this apparent theatre, that they're clashing, but the reality is they're not. They're actually empowering each other further. You know, outsourcing online policing to what are mainly US and some Chinese platforms is undermining free speech and indeed British values, international values. The big thing is that compliance costs will fall disproportionately on the smaller platforms. You know, if we had a diversity of platforms, it might make sense. But with the bill as it's framed, as with the monopolies we have, it's frankly insanity. You know, I mean, imagine if we had two newspapers, I don't know, say, not picking them out, but New York Times and The Guardian across, you know, most of the Western world. I mean, how crazy would that be? You know, so I agree with almost everything that Toby said, save for one thing, which is I think the bill and other regulations that are happening will result in a massive, if subtle, growing erosion of freedoms. So my question is, and I would ask this because of my job, is that, you know, what can we do to start supporting free speech champions and British challengers to these, what are frankly digital empires?
Great question. That's a great question to finish up on. All of the contributions talking about lobbying interests, certain types of corporations, both big tech and the corporations and those in there. Who'd like to go first? I'll take you in any order. Francis, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, thank you. Bryce, commiserations for what's happening in Canada, which seems to be particularly bad on this and in other respects. And I fear for what's happening in your country. In terms of lobbying, the obvious answer is transparency. And the obvious way in which one can have transparency most effectively, particularly where not only is government closely connected to pharmaceutical companies, but so are, and other companies, but so are big newspaper groups. And the sponsorship extends even to the Daily Telegraph, which has considerable funding from the Gates Fund, the International Health part of the Telegraph, I think, has funding from the Gates Foundation or its subsidiaries. And that's what's reduced through online censorship. And Colin, the cost of enforcement point, I agree with that. And that's a particular problem if you have a system, a regulatory system, where you have an obligation as a company to investigate and you are treated as a publisher, even potentially if you're not directly made aware of the content. So I think the traditional way, which actually goes back to a notice board, so it's derived from a common law principle. If you have a notice board in the village that's available for anyone to put an advertisement on or a notice, you're not a publisher unless somebody says that notice, or to the local parish council or something, that notice is very offensive, and you should take it down, and then you don't take it down, then you become a publisher. That's exactly the right way, and that's much more proportionate to smaller companies. And also, I agree entirely that that any regulatory framework needs to take into account the proportionality, the proportionate cost that this regulation would have on these companies.
Thanks. Jenny? Jenny?
Yes, so the question on, are we on a trajectory towards more authoritarianism or more democracy? I mean, it's an interesting one. And, I mean, on this, I do take Toby's point on this in terms of, it's not a done deal. It's not an easy battle. I think we are living in quite fearful and, fearful times where the pursuit of safety, however selective it is, does lead to a kind of underpricing of liberty. However, I just think that's where we need to have the discussion, and it's partly having the discussion, having the argument that is the best chance of pushing towards more democracy rather than more authoritarianism. I also think it's not a very stable process. This is what I found that's interesting, and whether it's tech companies or governments, they get into all kinds of other institutions, they get into a mess about this all the time, that, there seems to be these issues that everyone can agree on. And then something happens like the debate around gender self-identification, where actually people are a lot more split. And then it does make it, it just throw up that there are, at least two sides to particular discussions. And I think there's quite a lot of issues out there like that, because I don't think anyone's got a kind of a planned agenda they're trying to push through. I think there is just this sort of default kind of soppy kind of position that people go to, where they go, yeah, that's not very nice, we shouldn't have it. And then the contradictions emerge. I mean, one thing that I do think about the pandemic is that, I think people's response to that was because it was about human bodies as opposed to speech. I mean, obviously there was then a lot of restricting of speech and discussion about it by both governments and big tech, and there was a lot of propaganda and all of those things. But I think that was a slightly different discussion to begin with than the discussions, the kind of culture wars issues that rage around, that people take positions on, which are much more self-consciously symbolic. Anyway, I just wanted to say that because I don't think it was necessarily the public that wrapped up fear of catching a virus with the supposed danger of talking about it. I think that was what the elites did and what the state did.
Thanks, Jenny. Just Toby, also, I mean, just to throw into this as well, that obviously within the recommendations and the back and forth is the role of Ofcom. And Ofcom had a very particular role in the last 2 years about, what was able to be said and what not. And its role, you may want to just say one or two things about that, what your thoughts are, but feel free to.
I do worry about making Ofcom the regulator. That was an open question in the white paper, but was answered in the first published version of the bill. And Ofcom doesn't have a particularly great track record, and I don't think covered itself in glory in particular during the pandemic. So as you know, Alan, but others may not know, on the same day that the first lockdown was announced in March 2020, Ofcom issued its coronavirus guidance to broadcasters that it regulated. And the guidance essentially said, if you have people on your programs who are challenging the government's position and the advice being disseminated by public health authorities, if they're challenging, for instance, the effectiveness of masking or the usefulness of lockdowns as a way of trying to reduce infections, you have to treat them with extreme care. Don't give them free rein. Treat them with caution. And the way this was interpreted by many broadcasters was just to not have any dissenting voices on their programs, which is why it often felt like you were listening to just one point of view over the 2-year period. There were, of course, some dissenting voices, Lord Sumption, for instance, but not very many. And the Free Speech Union challenged that coronavirus guidance. We applied for permission to judicially review it in the High Court, and we had an oral hearing, and the judge denied us permission, and that put an end to that process. But that suggests to me that Ofcom isn't the ideal regulator to regulate social media. I think more broadly on this question about are Western democracies heading in a more authoritarian direction? I think they are. And as Jenny says, it's a kind of benign form of totalitarianism that is the real threat. It's a kind of nice totalitarianism in which the things you're prevented from saying are things which are allegedly are going to either cause people harm because they're going to make them less observant of COVID restrictions, less likely to take the vaccine. So they're straightforwardly physically harmful, according to the censors, or they're psychologically harmful. They're going to make people feel unsafe, threatened in some way. They're going to offend people. And so it's always done with the censorship is always done with the best of intentions. But I think one of the reasons we are living in a more censorious age, and things are only getting worse and will get worse, I think, before they get better, is that we have a kind of public morality now in a way we didn't, as recently as 25 years ago, but which we did, 75 years ago, when in the West, when Christianity was much more widespread and there was much more Christian worship, and people were much more religiously observant. We did have a kind of religious public morality. And if you transgressed against those religious values, you know, if you were an adulterer, for instance, you know, you could be publicly shamed. You were something of an outcast. But there was a kind of brief period, a kind of 50-year period in which there wasn't this public morality. There was a bit of public morality, but not nearly as much. It was a kind of brief emergence into the light, in which what you could say, you were much less likely to be punished for transgressing against sacred values, because there were far fewer sacred values, and people were more tolerant, and we lived in a more kind of permissive, licentious era. But more recently, with the emergence of a kind of secular religion, which has a lot in common with Christianity, which, you know, for want of a better word, is the kind of, you know, the woke religion, with a kind of strong authoritarian strain within it. So you've seen these institutions, even private companies, embrace this kind of woke ideology, and it's become the public morality. And if you dissent from it, you're likely to get cancelled, get censored, get kicked off social media platforms. And so I think it's all, and clearly social media has played a kind of big role in accelerating, facilitating the emergence of this new secular religious dogma, which has made for a much more kind of authoritarian atmosphere in contemporary liberal democratic societies. And as to when that's going to kind of ease up, when is that kind of, that people refer to it as the Great Awakening, clearly to make the analogy with religious awakenings in the past. And if you look up great awakenings, religious awakenings on Wikipedia, you'll see that they tend to last between 50 and 70 years. So it could be that we're looking at, you know, a 50-year horizon before this kind of woke, secular, dogmatic, authoritarian religion subsides, and we kind of emerge again into a more permissive era. That may be pessimistic, but my impression is, you know, we're in this for the long haul, and it's going to be quite a fight.
Okay, thank you. I can see some hands up. I just want to have something for the panelists to think about, and the audience as well, which is that a lot of people in the anti-lockdown fraternity have talked about the authoritarianism of leaders and of the government. Toby's just made some observations about how he sees things, about other actors that are imposing those things that are restriction. I think it'd be interesting to hear what other people think, to what extent the real concerns around suffocation of speech are coming from a government. Some people think there is a direct, people have talked about lobbyists and big pharma, big corporations, but where there's some kind of plan, or as Jenny's saying, that there's a series of reactions to these things. And actually there's different groups who have not necessarily government, but having influence on civil servants and on the government and on institutions and on the academy, you know, academic institutions and the workplace, that are, and perhaps, dare we say it, in the anti-lockdown fraternity, there's also a sense of some things that you shouldn't be saying that, or you can't say that, or let's report them on social media for saying these things or those things, almost like pointing the finger back at in the same way, and to what extent we should say there should be unbridled free speech, or what people think about all of that. So have a think about that, please, and anyone could come back on it. And we've got Paul, and then someone whose name I can't see, but I'll come to Paul first, and I'll come to the next person. Paul, please.
Yeah, hello. Just a quick question for Francis Hoare. So I just wanted clarification. Is there ever a situation where misinformation or stating facts that aren't true, is that ever illegal? The reason I ask that is that that could be used as an argument for censorship. So if you go, for example, if you go onto Google and search for climate skeptics, you'll get a load of websites that criticize climate skeptics. If you've gone to DuckDuckGo and you search climate skeptics, you get genuine links to websites that really are climate skeptics. Now, Google could easily argue it's not just that climate skepticism is harmful or dangerous, but that in the future it should be illegal because they're stating facts that aren't true that could lead to the deaths of people. So there should be clarification on that, please.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to just quickly handle that, please, and then I'll come.
Yeah. No, it's not illegal. But the problem is that the way in which social media companies
construct their censorship, which effectively is what it is exactly that they take this view. I mean, we're all familiar with the science fiction dynamic where the master computers that have this fixed rules are interpret those rules in a particular way. That means that they are able to control people because they are doing what they perceive as something that is harmful to the human race, and that's exactly that paradigm with climate change, and indeed with criticizing the public health dynamic. So no, it's not illegal, but yes, there is a real concern that the way in which harm is potentially defined, undefined term harm, or undefined terms such as a person adult of reasonable firmness caused serious harm, which is undefined and isn't necessarily a criminal offence, could be used to restrict speech about those things. Yes, and that's happening already on social media companies.
Okay, thanks. So I can see some of their hand up. It's I haven't got a name with you. Hi. You're on mute as well. There we go.
Hang on. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can hear you now.
Yeah, my name's Parag Shah. Nice to meet everyone, and thanks very much for putting this together. I've recently just watched an old movie by Woody Allen, 1973, Sleeper, along with George Orwell. He predicted a time when it's all becoming mechanical, digital machines controlling aspects of our life, not just free speech, but as we've discovered, freedom of movement, and also freedom of now, imminently, freedom of spending with digital money that's programmable, that can decide what you should and shouldn't spend on. And I personally would like to see the sentiment amongst people here address all of it, frankly, and because I think it's all related and captured very well by a chap called Majid. I forgot his surname. Majid Nawaz, that's it, on a Joe Rogan show that was 3 hours long. His last hour was brilliant, and I'm wondering if I think the question to everybody is there a way we can, as a group concerned about liberty generally, address not just free speech, but freedom of movement, freedom of spending, because basically these movies and these novels have come true. They're not coming true, they have come true. Yeah, we are, the movie portrayed us as barbarians in the wild, but we're actually here on Zoom, and I think we've got a big job ahead of us, but I'd like to get all of that onto our agenda as well as free speech. It's imminent.
Thank you, Parag. Great points there. Chris, please. You need to come off mute, Chris.
I think I should start by expressing our solidarity with Bryce and the Canadian truckers' movement for freedom. So, like, a big clap, yeah. And as I said, like, give our solidarity to them. Yeah, it strikes me that, I mean, like Francis's clear framework, I quite like the sound of it. But I think the reason why a clear framework is actually anathema to this bill, why it is so ill-defined, is because it's reflecting the type of kind of sort of political culture, woke identitarian politics and culture that we have, because that's all on a psychological basis. So it's not about actually providing, even though they use this term in the bill, providing proof that harm was caused, right? There's no need, that's dispensed with, there's no need for proof. It's all about, psychological harm. Under the communications section, it's saying it's dispensing with the previous terms of harm, grossly offensive, obscene, or indecent harms. As I said, instead, it's based on the intended psychological harm amounting to at least serious distress to the person who receives the communication, rather than requiring proof that harm was caused. So, as I said, in that context, right, and reflecting that kind of sort of political culture that we've got, the bill is not going to be, or it's not possible to have a clear framework. And therefore it makes it much more arbitrary and open to literally abuse, totalitarian abuse. And the thing is, I think in terms of the whole bill itself, you know, I would say that its title should be the online safety bill for the elite, right? Because that seems to be what it's about. It's about kind of defending the elite and shutting everybody else up. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Chris. I just want to see if there are other people who want to speak now, because we're going to come into the latter part of it, and I can see a couple of, but just checking on here. Okay, right. So I have something to say just about why we did this series and why this thing is really important, the online safety bill, and our conversation about it. But to address maybe the point Prague was making and ask the panel something, because it does strike us that whilst there are separate bills and acts that are going on, like the police crime sentencing courts bill, the fact is that we know that the police have been out saying that offence can be criminal, or discrimination is criminal, and people have, you know, sometimes you can't get the police to come around for a burglary, but people are going around to people's houses because of things they've posted, and people are being arrested because of things they've posted on the internet. And you can see how the concerns of people are looking at things like digital identification, what's happening with what you can say and where you can say it, and the digital arena, but in real life as well. And then obviously how we can congregate, and whether, you know, what that means, the police sentencing bill around too noisy, the events, whatever they might be, that it can just look like, maybe this is what the panel thinks it is, or different people have different views, just look like this whole big grab to take a whole section of public sphere and what's happened, just to push back everything that's happened in the last 300 years and just get it under some complete social credit system control like we have in China, right? And many people think that. Or is it the case that these are a series of kind of turf wars, and the free speech one has been a big one for the last 250, 300 years, right? It's not like it's suddenly come about now. But how this is related to some of the other, what we see was going on with the police crime and sentencing bill, and some of our concerns, is it just in the arena of online safety? And any thoughts about how you would challenge that more, you know, beyond that, at the level of what ordinary people might be able to do, you know, what you individually, what you think about that, what ordinary people can do to insist upon, whether it's true what Toby's saying, that many might not want to, and if the silent majority can be made a little bit more vocal. We at Together certainly have many views about that, right? But I'll be interested to hear specifically what each of you think on that. Great. So let's do that in with a different order to where we just done it. And you can take any of the other questions. And if you've got any final points, put your hands up, please, because we're going to be coming towards the end. So Toby first, please.
Well, my answer, predictably, Alan, will be you can join the Free Speech Union, which for students, pensioners, veterans only costs $24.95 a year. For everyone else, $49.95. But we also accept overseas members for $24.95. And I think people banding together to protect themselves is the way forward. I think you have to organize, you have to become politically savvy. And that doesn't just mean, I don't just mean organize under the umbrellas of political parties and contest elections or campaign for candidates, though I think that's also important. But there are kind of platoons you can set up in civil society to fight for our rights, like the right to free speech. And you can, you know, it's surprising how much of the law there is that still protects our rights, including the right to free speech. We spend a lot of our time fighting attempts to punish people for exercising their lawful right to free speech. fighting in the courts and appealing to the law to try and make sure free speech is better protected in universities, in schools, in museums, galleries, heritage institutions, and so forth. I think that's the way forward. Join the Free Speech Union, set up your own lobby groups, figure out ways to influence the government and to defend our rights in a way that's effective. Don't just complain. Don't be too fatalistic. Don't opt out of the system. Figure out how we can use the levers that are already there to better defend our rights.
And can I just ask, Toby, do you believe that anyone should be allowed to say absolutely anything at any time?
No. Well, I think my rule is the same as that of the Supreme Court when defining what the limits are to the First Amendment. So I don't think people should be able to say things that are overwhelmingly likely to lead to imminent violence. But short of that, I think pretty much everything should be permitted, yes.
Okay, thanks. Francis, please.
I agree with everything Toby said, but I'd also say that we have a duty when we do come together to teach people about the need for liberty and the philosophical underpinnings of it, not in a sort of lecturing way, but in the kind of way that Margaret Thatcher did and many others when she was talking about freedom in more general terms, and particularly economic freedom and the importance of that, like her or not. She was a very effective campaigner, and that came on the back of a long and sustained campaign by people like Keith Joseph in the 1970s about economic freedom and the need for economic freedom, desirability. And again, like or not what they said, although they're very much promoting freedom, that was a very effective campaign. It was a very long campaign, and it took a very long time to establish those ideas and make them respectable. In a way by which I mean in a way that's likely to achieve some form of positive democratic result. So now I think we are faced again with the need, which we thought we'd won. We thought we'd be at the end of history, of Francis Fukuyama's phrase, after the end of the Cold War. We thought we'd won the battle for freedom, not just the free market, but the freedom of speech, freedom of movement, which was supposedly the objectives of the pro-EU side, who suddenly turned against freedom of movement as soon as they were told that would put their health at risk in 2020, and so on. So all of these things need to be constantly fought for, and particularly freedom. And I totally agree with Toby that the whole point about a liberal democratic system rather than the radical democratic system is that you do need a state, paradoxically, in order to prevent the demos from restricting freedom, because ultimately demoses very often do want to do that. But in order to ensure the kind of framework that we need for that, the kind of laws that we need to protect freedom of speech, we do need laws and we do need civic society. We need constantly to impress upon people that the real need for society or freedom in general, and the very acme of that is freedom of speech, because without freedom of speech, we can't defend the other freedoms that come from it.
Thanks, Francis. Jenny, please.
So I think what can be a lot of fun is kind of poking at cracks in the consensus, right? Because there are loads of them. It seems to me that we're living in a very strange time at the moment, where we've got on the one hand this sort of these like moral binaries, you know, you will kill granny if you go out, you know, it's like that's good, that's bad, you know, the completely moral binaries. And then you've just got this extreme relativism where people can't agree on anything. Now that is very frustrating intellectually, I find, but it does mean that, you know, if there is actually an attempt to sort of organize around a definition of harm or what counts as disinformation or any of these things, which relies on that consensus, there's always going to be people who have
Oh, we've got a little moment there.
Actually appreciate that life is rather more complicated than social media rules say it is. I also think in terms of public space, and this goes for the internet as well, you can't have public space without the public. Part of the reason why public space physically has become so much more regulated in recent years is actually because there's no one there, interestingly. If you see what happens when people do try and kind of engage with public space, the state finds it much more difficult to handle. With the internet, you know, people will go elsewhere. Or we've seen this phenomenon with publishing. It's going to be interesting how that works out, that as publishing becomes more and more censorious about what writers can say, well, at what point will people just stop buying the books because they're too boring? So I think we should, whilst acknowledging that there is a lot of debate to be had, you know, we can't take you know, the kind of public democratic sphere for granted. I think we should also remember how strong that is, and that's something that's really worth doing.
All right, thank you. In a minute, I'm going to ask each panelist to do a kind of like a snapshot about what they think specifically on the online safety bill, about if something should be challenged within it, what and how. Just to say that the next panel event will be on the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Bill, which is linked to this, but obviously separate. One of the things is that we've, you know, since we launched it together in August, we've been very frustrated by some of the much of the lockdown, like everyone else, and how we were separated and isolated. And in many ways, the public sphere was reduced entirely just to being online for many people for a long time, and made it even more important, as has been said. And we sort of committed, as one of our 7 pillars, we're entirely committed to the idea of free speech and open debate. And so we will be sending some following on from this, some correspondence and doing some calls to action about how we think people can actually get in touch with their MPs and get in touch with government, even though this has gone through a number of iterations, and we'll be finding out on the 18th, because even when things come out and we've already done consultations on it, we can respond and we can have our voices heard and we can have an impact, as we've seen already. And that will be the same for the Police Crime Sentencing Bill, which is at a different stage of evolution in going through that process. And we really are going to insist ourselves that we can continue to make our voices heard as much as possible, even when that's controversial or difficult. And so that's why we thought that this series was really important to have, where you have different, like, digging down on it, not just regurgitating what some people are projecting about things, trying to deal with some of the particular issues and also some of the general ones. Often I find that sometimes various different, if you want to call them sides, will say very similar things, and many people will say those things, but getting to the heart of some of these issues and the actual specifics of them is really important for us to understand that. And I happen to think a little differently to Toby, that I think that the demos is this abstract idea of the people, whatever you've got, but ordinary people have been the ones actually who've transformed the world and made history, and we can rely on them to do that with ourselves if we give a lead, really. And that, in a way, that's perhaps Together's project to try and embrace and engage the public to do that. And for that, we do need free speech, and I definitely agree with Francis on that and the other panelists. So I'm going to ask, in the opposite order to when you spoke, to just do a couple of minutes snapshot on what you think should happen, you know, with this. And obviously, Toby's introduced some new information, so that might affect your summary on it, or any other thoughts you've had about some of the things that have come up in the debate today and the discussion. So we'll start with Francis, please.
Alan, thanks. I've given quite a lot about what I thought about and think about the bill and my proposals instead. So I'm just going to finish with 3 points, if I may. The first and most fundamental is that it is not the government's role to keep the public safe from all harm, and particularly not from the harm that might arise from wrongthink. Lukyanov and Haidt, in The Coddling of the American Mind back in 2018, said this: fragility is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think certain ideas are dangerous or are encouraged to do so by trigger warnings and safe spaces, you will be more anxious in the long run. Intellectual safety not only makes free and open debate impossible, it is setting up a generation for more anxiety and depression. Secondly, the problem about government prescribing something as a danger is that it leads to a search for a solution. It's not a matter for the government to regulate what is disinformation and misinformation. Had the government proposed that with books it did not like and said that they should be laced with warnings and introduced by fact checking, it would have been ridiculed, and it would rightly have been ridiculed. And thirdly and finally, the government, at least with the bill as it stood, appears to have adopted the idea that it is desirable to identify not only what is truth, but unless all speech is to be categorized as either true, particularly partially true or false, what opinions are worthy of correction and what are not. And I leave you on some words from John Stuart Mill. The particular evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error.
Thank you, Francis. Jenny, I'm going to ask you now, please.
I really don't know how to follow that. I suppose I would just say this is not a technical, this bill is not something technical that is designed as a kind of a technical thing, which is sort of the way that it puts itself across. It speaks to much more fundamental issues about how we engage with each other in society. And these debates that are all in that about how, what we mean by free speech, why we need it, how we define harm, who decides, all of these kind of questions are complicated questions that cannot be satisfactorily kind of addressed and answered in a bill purporting to be about something as nebulous as online safety.
Okay, great, thank you. And Toby, please.
Yeah, well, I would reassure people that well, first of all, I don't think that, my ideal would be if we could just indefinitely delay this bill, so effectively kick it into the long grass. But I don't think that's going to be politically possible. I think it is going to pass in due course. So our only option is to try and improve it as much as we can. And the various groups that have been lobbying to improve it, I think have succeeded in removing some of the more dangerous parts of it. And the committees who've reviewed it and published reports on it in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, I think have also contributed to the improvement of the bill. And so I think the next step, when the next iteration is published, and as I say, I think it'll be next week, will be to first scrutinize it quite carefully and then to see if we can improve it even more. And the thing to focus on, I think, will be to make the protections for speech in the bill even more robust, particularly the duty the bill will impose on social media companies and search engines like Google to uphold free speech. We need to make that much more onerous than just have regard for. Even if it's have particular regard for, that means something very different legally, and that will. And this will be the kind of crucial stuff when in the future we're fighting to get people like Michael Senger reinstated. We want to be able to point to language in the bill which the courts should be paying attention to, which the regulator should be bound by. So it's very important that we try and get as much of that wording improved if we can, to make the battles we're inevitably going to have to fight over internet censorship in future just a little bit easier.
Well, thank you, and thank you all three. Recently, we at Together all supported a campaign to reinstate Bernie Spofforth, who had a similar suspension to Michael Senger, and remarkably quickly, within a few hours, she was put back on, and we thought it was a mini victory, but actually, obviously, the line of travel is one where it keeps happening all the time. And I take that point very seriously. For people moving forwards now, we're going to have the next panel series on next Wednesday, and then we're going to have a live event on the 28th. It is notable today that President Biden said that they're seriously looking into and contemplating the issuance of a digital dollar and what that might mean and its relationship to digital ID and a central bank digital currency and what all that might mean. And they're important things to think about in the context of many of the issues we've been looking at in this last period. I would just say that, and I think that Toby's point really resonated with me thinking about the idea, would people substitute safety ongoing for liberty? And I think in many ways, it's not a question of how long a pendulum swings or whether there's this innate inherent thing about the public. It's like everything, isn't it? It's like, it depends. And I think that it depends on perhaps what we do, and we individually and we together, and how much of a leadership and how much we can inspire and influence and get people to come and join in the fight for our own rights and our freedom. And free speech, as Francis says, goes to the heart of that, because you can't address anything if you can't speak freely about it. So it seems to me that it's been really good discussion today, and some of the questions that have come up, and Jenny's questions about judgment and authority. Sometimes I think the government's just a little weak, even then when it looks like it's really strong and authoritarian, and that's why it attempts to have all these codifications of things. But actually, at the heart of it, perhaps, is this sense that we're all children that need to be protected, and that somehow we haven't got the capability to hear and see things without suddenly turning into violent maniacs or far right or far left extremists, or whatever the terms may be. And that actually most people are decent and we can manage these things, and actually we should insist upon it. And I think in many ways for Together, one of the central ideas is that we can insist upon having free speech everywhere, and we should make our voices heard about that. And that's with MPs, and that's with government and everyone. So I want to thank the panel, the panelists this evening, for really good contributions. And as ever, it's not as though the discussion, like the one between Burke and Locke and others, has been some time in the making, a discussion about free speech back and forth. Thank you very much, everyone. And this will be live streamed. It's been live streamed and recorded as well. And we will be coming out to all our signatures as well with next steps as well. We look forward to see what happens on the 18th. Thank you very much, everyone.